So, welcome to another episode of Five Star Conversations, where we dive deep into the journeys of hospitality's most influential leaders. And today we have the privilege of speaking with James Goodwin. Welcome, James.
Hi there. Welcome, everyone.
So, James Goodwin is an experienced executive and non-executive director with a background in media, corporate affairs, and public policy. He was appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of Accommodation Australia, AA, in September 2024. That is the national body representing the interests of hotels, motels, and accommodation providers. There are more than 1,000 member properties who collectively have more than 120,000 accommodation rooms. Prior to his role with AA, Mr. Goodwin was the CEO of Australian Airports Association, which is the AAA, for more than 4 years, including a time when the aviation industry was being heavily impacted by, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic. James was also Chief Executive of Australia's leading vehicle safety advocate, the Australian New Car Assessment Program, or ANCAP as we know it, from 2015 to 2020. And before joining ANCAP, Mr. Goodwin held the position of Director, Government Relations and Communication at the Australian Automobile Association, and was also acting chief executive. So you've worked for a lot of companies that have A's in them, actually, James. There's a bit of a pattern there. James also held a profile senior community and corporate affairs position at Air Services Australia, the provider of air traffic control and aviation firefighting in Australia. And James was also head of media and communications with the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries, which represents the vehicle and motorcycle brands in Australia. Mr. Goodwin is the chair of St John's Ambulance ACT, is a member of the National St John's Ambulance Australia Board, and was appointed by the Governor-General as an Officer of the Order of St John's in 2022. James is a board member of the Canberra Institute of Technology Solutions and was previously appointed to the ACT Road Safety Advisory Board and was an inaugural board member of Auto Skills Australia in 2010. The organisation tasked with reforming vocational education and training within the automotive industry. James was previously a reporter and a newsreader in Sydney and Canberra, including periods in Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery, and he holds a bachelor's degree in communications and politics. So welcome again, James.
Thanks very much. It's a long bio. I've done quite a bit when you look at that and you read that out. So no, happy to talk about that and how I got here.
Yeah, well, that's the first question, I suppose, is, you've had a long career over lots of different industries, but before joining Accommodation Australia, what drew you to the accommodation industry?
Well, certainly, I may not have worked in the hospitality sector before, but I have worked in perhaps the associated sectors, so tourism and aviation that certainly go with that. And even when I worked for the Automobile Association, it effectively represents the touring companies as it was. So the tourism, perhaps when the cars started and we needed to rate hotels to understand, and even rating restaurants, so things like the stars and things like that. So although I've not worked in the accommodation and the hospitality sector directly, I've had a lot of links and a lot of interactions with the sector. And look, what attracted me is it's a sector that is exciting, and it's also the people. There's really some passionate people, and I wouldn't say that other sectors I've worked in don't have passionate people, but this is a very people-orientated sector, and that's perhaps I've worked for perhaps a little more maybe mechanical or infrastructure sectors in the past. So this one is certainly much more front and center of the people, and the people being the most important people that provide that experience. So that's what attracted me, excitement and the passion of the people.
I love that. Yes, very much a people industry, and we'll talk later about technology, but I think the common view is despite what technology gets introduced, it will always be a people industry, a people first industry, I suppose, if that's the way you want to put it.
Yeah, absolutely.
James, coming from a role outside of traditional hotels, what surprised you most about the accommodation industry?
Probably the biggest surprise I've been learning about now. I mean, when you start learning about things, you often put this through your own lens and judge where you sit on the spectrum. Am I the ordinary guest or consumer or customer? Probably the biggest thing that surprised me over the past couple of months is that people apparently aren't watching TVs in their hotel room anymore. Or certainly watching them differently. When you think about it, it does start making sense. with streaming services and so on, that often people are just, well, it's easier to watch it on their iPad and things like that. So I was quite surprised to learn that I am a little bit different, because that was probably something I would do in a hotel room, is watch the TV or have those channels that you don't have at home. But that's all starting to change. So that's probably something that I found the most perhaps curious or interesting about shifts in the sector.
Interesting. You're right. I mean, it's been happening for a while. I mean, guests have been bringing their own content for many years. It was iTunes or thumb drives quite a few years ago where people used to, start bringing movies along and wanting to connect them to TVs. And then obviously Netflix and casting has changed that dramatically. So there's an interesting shift in guest expectations these days.
Yeah.
What leadership lessons from your previous roles have proven valuable in coming into Accommodation Australia?
Well, certainly, my previous role with airports and aviation, obviously lots of dynamics and lots of links there, very, very similar in that based on numbers, how you're filling aircraft is very similar to how you're filling rooms and those sorts of things. But what I'd say is being dynamic and being flexible, and also understanding that you're not necessarily going to have all the answers yourself. So I often work on a bit of a model where, what are the issues that I'm going to be leading on? What are the issues that I am facilitating? And what are the issues that I might be collaborating on? And that's perhaps a scale that I work on, where if it's about perhaps advising members on federal politics or a media strategy or how we should be communicating to government, well, I will take the lead on that. That is my expertise, regardless of what sector it is. But if I need to understand what an incoming potential regulation is going to have on the hotel and the hoteliers, I know I'm not the expert of necessarily being able to interpret that. So going and getting that information. And then the third element is the collaboration. Well, sometimes you might think, well, a potential change, we need to work together with some other sectors. And so how do we do that, and identifying those issues to be able to work together with other parts of the tourism sector or so on. That's how I sort of like to operate. So being comfortable that you're not necessarily the expert in the room, but understanding how you're going to get that answer is what I think is very movable between whatever sector you're working in.
I like that. Yeah, no, it's coordinating and bringing all those relevant parties together with their expertise. Yeah, that's good. What do you see as the biggest challenge representing or advocating for such a diverse industry? Because we've got boutique hotels through to international chains. Australian representation in the boutique hotels often, and with the international chains, obviously overseas mandates quite often as well. What do you see as the challenge there?
Where I'd say there are probably three areas that are the same, no matter the size, the scale, or the type of accommodation that you might be. And that's number one would be demand, whether that's tourist demand or demand generally. And we're focusing probably a lot on the travellers and the tourists. But if you get to perhaps a country town motel, well, perhaps that's a bit more of a business to business relationship, because there might be an infrastructure project going on up the road. So you're filling rooms not necessarily with tourists, but they are out-of-towners, and they could be working on a mining project, a road project, a rail project, and things like that. So they are still the guests, and they still need that experience. So demand is important. We need to get those international tourists back. International tourism is still not back at the same levels as pre-COVID. And the sort of tourists that we're getting are changing. So at the moment, the highest country of origin for tourists is New Zealand. But as we love our New Zealand friends, but they're not necessarily participating in the visitor economy the same as perhaps an American tourist or a European tourist.
Yeah.
They might be here perhaps more to visit friends and relatives than to participate in the visitor economy. So it's a demand, wherever that's coming from, no matter what size or scale or type of business that you might be in the sector, demand is important. We've got those pressures on demand at the moment. Workforce, wherever you are, again, the issues are probably there, but the scale might be different. So attracting and then retaining the workforce is very important. but also the other issues that go with that. So perhaps the industrial relations framework that we might have, and also things like visa and migration issues to be able to get the right staff members. So that's all. There's a lot of issues there and in that category. But whether you're small boutique, whether you're in regional suburban areas, or whether you're in the CBD, workforce is certainly the issue there. And third, I'd probably say is some of the more behind the scenes, more operating costs. There's a lot of talk in the community and in politics around the cost of living crisis, and there is that, and we understand that. There's less discussion around the cost of doing business crisis that's going on. The energy costs, the planning rules, the red tape, the green tape, all of those sorts of things that are really impacting the businesses at the moment. There's those compliance costs that go with that, and you need the staff to be able to do that. But also the real costs, those energy bills that are just not going away and just going up. And we just know you can't always pass that on. So there's a real squeeze at the moment that we're seeing there. So that'd be my three that I think are across the board, no matter where you are. So demand, workforce, and then those operating costs.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It doesn't matter whether you're boutique or whether you are an international chain; those same three pressures are exerted on your business. Which leads to a good question, I suppose. As we know, the accommodation sector is often affected by government regulations, tourism policies, and economic conditions. What policy or industry initiative would you like to see happen in the next couple of years to sort of help the industry?
I've probably listed a few there, and where I'd say there's let's get those tourists back. And what are the levers that the government can pull? Well, really, we need to get the airlines and the airline capacity back to bring them here into Australia. So opening up those skies and making sure that we're encouraging those international carriers to bring those tourists here. That's certainly a role that the Australian government plays, and also being flexible enough with things like what are those key markets that we should be targeting. So is there growth in perhaps Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Thailand and places like that? India, obviously a growth market as well. Are we capitalizing on that enough? Possibly not. So I think we should be looking at that. But one point I'd say with relating to workforce is skills and training. And the accommodation sector, we've got about 110,000 people directly employed in accommodation, and then probably double that when you include food service and hospitality included. And then we feel that we've got a lot more, we've got thousands more people who probably work in our sector as a second job. But as a quirk of the Bureau of Statistics, they're really only counting you as your main job. So we estimate that we probably have another 50,000 people who are working in the sector as a second role. And so that's very important. But unfortunately, they're really leaving the formal education frameworks, the formal vocational education and training frameworks. So we'd really like to see perhaps a bit more focus on that we want people to finish those chef apprenticeships. We want to recognise the traineeships that you might be able to do outside apprenticeships to make sure that we are skilling our workforce and investing in our workforce, because in turn, that means we will have a better workforce, they'll feel more satisfied, and they'll have those qualifications there. So yeah, that's something that I'm concerned about, that we've got a lot of highly skilled people in our sector, but you might be hard pressed to find them with a qualification.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Talking to colleagues, that's their point. Finding people has become a little bit easier than it was after COVID, but skilled staff is still a challenge, most definitely. Yeah. In particular, some roles like engineering, which is not that common, but if you've had anything to do with a hotel engineer and housekeeping, they are both are the engine room of a hotel, because they're behind the scenes. But it was actually a general manager of the Park Hyatt that said guest expectations are higher than ever when it comes to the level of finish in the room. And so they're very critical about anything. So a good engineering team is really critical, and it's often hard to find them, because you can get a job in mining for considerably more or whatever. It's a challenge, I think, isn't it, for our industry to find that right skill set.
And equally IT, there are just we're so data heavy and so reliant on
Yep.
that. But perhaps those IT professionals aren't automatically thinking accommodation is a career for them, and so we need to get that message out there.
Yeah, it's a good point. That is a very good point. I suppose then, as an industry, how can accommodation providers work better together to ensure that we remain competitive and thrive?
Well, there's a good, it's an old saying, but the rising tide raises all boats or all ships, and I think there is something really in that. That if we still want that differentiation, and people will need different things when depending on why they're traveling or where they're traveling, but when we will be better respected, whether that's by the guests, by the government, by decision makers, by our associated entities like airlines and so on, if we do work better together and we're seen as trusted people to work with, we'll always be competitive. But 9 times out of 10, there's probably good reasons for actually getting together and working out those key issues. And that's where something like Accommodation Australia plays that role. That when we get together with our state advisory committees and things like that, it's interesting that the competition gets left at the door, which is
Yep.
a really good thing. And you don't see that in every sector. So we can do it, but where I think we need to, and this is one of my aims, is let's try and work on that shopping list. Let's actually narrow this down. If our list is too long, we're never going to win. We're never going to be able to tick those things off the list. So the aim is perhaps, and with things like a federal election coming, we've tried to perhaps narrow that down a little more. That's not saying that those other issues are not important, but they may not be for this time or for this time period. And so that's how I think we do work better together, is let's get a bit more focus on the issues that we're trying to deal with at this point in time, and then work better together on that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think Accommodation Australia has been a great step forward, having that one body representing our industry with those common goals. And I think from my experience talking to senior leaders, Matt Tripoloni from IHG was on this podcast last month, and he talked about getting a skilled workforce together. And his view was, I don't mind if they come into the industry and IHG trains them and they go to a competitor, as long as they stay in the industry, because he said, I think it benefits the industry as a whole. And we've all got to have that mentality that we're doing it for the good of the industry.
Doing it for the good of the industry. And that's perhaps where we are losing a lot of that. People are leaving that formal skills and training framework. So our training and those colleges will be well recognised in our industry. But if unfortunately there are things like we saw with the COVID pandemic where people might have had to leave the sector, unfortunately their 10, 20, 30 years in the accommodation sector wasn't recognised by another sector. And so that's where I want to try and make sure that all of that on-the-job training, which is structured, and you will be going to colleges and those internal colleges and things like that, is certainly recognised by the broader economy, not just our sector.
Yep, I like that. James, just a technology and innovation question. From your perspective as a leader, what role do you see technology playing in shaping the future of the sector?
We're a very labour intensive sector, and all the talk about things like AI and technology sometimes, or you could easily say, well, that'll bypass us. It won't matter. It's not for us. But no, it will. Where I can see, though, all the talk at the moment about things like AI and so on is often still very generic. That
Yes.
it's people are saying, that, oh yes, well, it can summarize your emails, and it can help you with a social media post, and it can do all of it. But that's all very generic.
Yep.
That might help the individual. It doesn't necessarily help the sector. But our sector is so reliant and so heavy with data that's where I see the future going. How can we, so if we get a boffin, they can actually understand our sector a little better, they will have the trump card. They will understand how this can work together. how do we better bring all those pieces of data together, the forward bookings, the rostering, the room allocations, even linking that with things like flight schedules so that you can roster the front desk according to how many people you're expecting to actually be getting off that flight, understanding if, for those business travelers, they'll probably try and put them on the one floor, because that will mean that housekeeping will have leave, because someone traveling for business is probably not going to leave the room in, they probably didn't use the bath, and they probably, didn't do, as opposed to people on a holiday. So that's where I can see when people start understanding our sector better, that's when developing those algorithms and those software systems that will better coordinate a lot of that data that we already have, that's where I see the benefits will go.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I was reading sometime last year, actually, that I think it's McDonald's are using AI from a predictive point of view to tell them how many fries to cook up at a certain time of the day, etc. And it's a simplified analogy, what you were talking about. But, they were saying rather than the individual team member necessarily using AI is helping from a rostering, a scheduling point of view, predicting what demand is likely to be. And I think a lot of that in our industry, we've relied on, unfortunately, on historical data and a bit of gut feel. And you're right, there's a lot of data there that we need some good technology to cross-reference that and help us from a future point of view. There's also some other technology. I was talking to a friend of mine who actually is a teacher in pastry at Ride called En Bleu. They went to the convention center and they've got a machine it's a water jet that actually cuts all the cakes perfectly. And it was quite interesting. He said, well, how come you've got that? And he mentioned how much it was. It's quite an expensive piece of equipment. He said, well, it cuts it perfectly. If I was to pay a chef to do that, quite a boring job, it wouldn't be very cost effective, and it wouldn't be very good for a chef, literally, their skills just to be cutting cakes literally all day. So I think the other thing that we see technology doing is helping staff. It could be, a robot that's cleaning. It could be any piece of technology.
I think we have to get out of this idea that technology is to take away jobs.
Yes, that's great.
We know that people want both. We want the best customer satisfaction forms and the feedback forms. Generally, when someone has had a really good person-to-person interaction, and we need to empower our teams to be able to do that, to have those conversations, to not necessarily follow that script if that's not what's needed. Recommending to that tourist, well, okay, you don't want dessert here, but make sure you go over the road so there's a great ice cream shop. Those sorts of things is what gives the good customer experience. But to free up people to be able to do that is where the technology can help. So perhaps before COVID, we probably saw that technology was more around, you'll need fewer people. But what we see is the customer expects both. They expect to be able to check in digitally on an app with no human interaction if that's what they want, but they still want somebody there. They still want to be able to, if there is a problem or if they have a special request, to be able to talk to someone. So technology also isn't necessarily a cost saving, which is something that we have to get across as a sector as well. If you're going to have technology, you have to invest in it. It has to work well and it has to be reliable. We need to find that balance between both the human experience and that personal experience, but also having that good technology that might free up that ability to be able to allow our teams to be able to provide the best service they can.
I couldn't agree with you more, James. Yeah, technology doesn't necessarily mean less staff. It means freeing them up for that, the human aspect of hotels. When you think about that check-in process, and it was a previous guest who'd been in the industry for a long time, and I asked him a technology-related question. He said, well, there's good and bad that comes with technology. He's old enough to have worked on a manual system, and he said, I saw the introduction of computers, and unfortunately, it just meant that staff now are looking at the computer more than they're looking at the guest, and that was a negative aspect. And what we're talking about now, as you said, is if we allow the guest to check in digitally, when they do arrive at the front desk, it is actually now again a face-to-face conversation without looking at the computer. So we've come almost full circle, and technology now actually enabling and helping us in that respect. James, if we were to look forward 10 years, what do you think the accommodation landscape in Australia would look like?
I would see that we're certainly going to have more technology like we've just been talking about, but I would say that the changes that we've seen coming out of COVID in this recovery period is that the accommodation providers are really doing a reset on who they are, the differentiation of the product, and perhaps the products, the buildings, the accommodation offerings reflecting more where they are. Perhaps we were getting to this idea a few decades ago where, if you're in a hotel in any city in
Yeah.
the world, it
Yeah.
will be exactly the same.
Yeah.
And for a while there, yeah, that might have been what we were after, that you had that same experience and you knew what the beds were going to be like, you knew what the rooms were going to be like. But I think we're seeing a callback and a shift of a bit more personality. And that's where I would see in the difference, between now and perhaps 10 years from now is, yes, there will still be, you need to have the level of the degrees of sameness, but I think the recognition that if you're staying in a CBD hotel in Sydney that can overlook Sydney Harbour, you need to embrace the harbour. That sort of idea, so that it provides the guests with an extension of that holiday. The room that they're staying in, the hotel they're staying in, reflects where they are. That they couldn't wake up and go, oh, am I in London or am I in Sydney? They will wake up and go, I know where I am. I know I'm in Adelaide. I know I'm in Brisbane. I know I'm certainly on the Sunshine Coast or somewhere like that. I think that's what we'll see is the change, that people are moving from wanting a holiday to wanting an experience.
Yep.
And that might be that there is things like even the food offering and the food and beverage is having more pop-up, and you might even have those local producers holding a stand, or the coffee cart, or the cakes are actually from someone across the road and things like that. So I think move to the experience
Yep.
and recognizing where you are and embracing that is where I can see things going.
Yeah, to your point, we're seeing that now where, hotel restaurants outsourced, and a lot of the produce is from within the local district. It's a really good thing. Obviously, great for sustainability as well, if you are not using lots of petrol to
Yep.
bring in your produce from around the country.
And the reality is that, people also want to feel that they're doing good when they're going on holiday now. And that's perhaps a bit of a change, that they want to understand that their money is not just going to the hotel, but they can see and recognize that that's gone to the local patisserie who has a link with the hotel, or the butcher, or all those sorts of things. So I think there's that sort of that social conscience that people have that is flowing through to the guest experience. And I can see that will grow in the next few years.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. James, if you could change one thing about the industry overnight, what would that be?
Oh, one thing. I mean, there are so many things, but look, if pushed, I would say we need to, as a country and as economy, get on top of short-term rental regulation.
Yep.
We
Okay.
need to level the playing field. We're okay with competition,
Yep.
but there needs to be a competitive market,
Yeah.
and short-term rentals are part of the accommodation sector. We have no concerns with hosted accommodation.
Mhm.
What we're concerned about is the rise in these investors who are buying properties they're never going to live in. They might be buying multiple properties and then listing them with short-term rentals. They're not paying the same rates. They're not paying the same taxes. They don't have to meet the same planning rules, the same
Yeah.
fire standards, all of those sorts of things. So I would say that, yeah, we're okay with competition, but it actually needs to be a competitive market. So yeah, if there was one thing, I would say that's what we need to do. We're also seeing from the other side, yes, we've got the vested interest in that, but we can also see that this is really having an effect on the housing affordability and the housing accessibility crisis that's
Mhm.
going on. We've got stories where we know, particularly in perhaps coastal communities, high tourist communities, where we can't get the staff we need because they can't find a house to live in.
Yep.
So we're seeing it from the other side as well, that this is impacting the housing stock. So that's probably what I would say is number one. Now, I don't necessarily have all the answers to that, but I think that is something that we need to do and need to have a nationally coordinated approach. And one, I think, is we need a register of all those short-term rental properties that you need to apply for that register, and there should be a cap on how many days that they could be used. And then it's up to the owners and the individuals to decide, well, actually, do they stay on short-term rentals and you need to pay the appropriate, you need to run that as a business, as a proper business, or return it back to the long-term rental market.
That's a great point. Yes, it is. It is an issue, and I think to your point, yes, having a level playing field is really what we're after
What
there.
we're after.
Yeah, no, definitely. James, we're going to get ready to wrap up. I just wanted to ask, is there a book or a leader that's had a profound impact on your career?
I'm not sure if it's the career, but I always think my career and my personal life have always been so linked that interested in the world, interested in politics, interested in the media and things like that. Look, a book probably from high school that has always stuck with me, and every couple of years I'll go and reread it, is Catcher in the Rye.
Right.
And the main character, Holden Caulfield. And look, I probably read it as I was probably around the same age as the main character, sort of 15, 16. But I think what stayed with me over that time with that book is you can still be an outsider even if you're on the inside. That just because you're there, you can also be lonely in a crowd as well, and how do you get on top of those sorts of things. So I think that's one book that has certainly stayed with me, both as a manager and as an individual as well. So as a manager, to make sure that you are still checking in with people, both personally and professionally. I always have a lot of people talk about professional development. Well, I always turn that around and say, what about personal development?
Yeah.
Because if we've got good, engaged, enthusiastic staff, then they'll also be good employees as well. And so linking both the personal and the professional development is what that has sort of stuck with me. Quite a milestone read when I was about 14, 15, whenever I was, yeah.
I love that. I must admit that's a book I've never read, so I will now have to go out and hunt it down and have a read. James, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that, and it's really good to get to know. And over the 6 months or so that I've been in the role, and I know a lot of the accommodation providers have this sort of bit of a strange concern when I ask, oh, I'll catch up with you when I check in, and that it's not to check in on them, it's to catch up with them and and test those things, learn about things. Ask them, this is what I'm working on. Is that right? Is that what you're seeing and you're experiencing on the ground? So, no, I do always try and do that. That if I'm traveling for some reason and when I'm checking in or when I'm checking out, actually, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes with the supervisor or the general manager, even just taking me for a walk around and things like that, it's really fascinating and it's really interesting to get that understanding and to hear the passion that people have. It's really great, and it's a great industry to be in.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that. That checking in is
Checking in isn't checking up.
no, it's a good point. Good point. But just getting a feel for, as you said, what is going on, what are the challenges, what is happening in the industry, because things change a lot. Obviously, we talked about demand, and demand can be up, can be down. It can be, there's a lot that impacts the accommodation sector. So
it's also very powerful for me, and this is why I do like, and the people listening and watching. Why do I do it? I do it because it's actually very powerful for me when I am in Canberra, and that's where I spend most of my days. If I have a meeting with a senior bureaucrat to talk about our issues in our sector, they can quite often say, well, what would you know, James? But if I can turn around and say, well, only yesterday I was talking to the general manager of a CBD hotel, or only yesterday or only last week, I was at a country town motel and I was talking to the owners and they told me this. It is actually very powerful to bring those stories back to Canberra, because I know that those public servants won't have done that, and to be able to help tell those stories is very important when we're trying to advocate for a sector. So when I've got those issues top of my mind, because I've seen it, and sometimes I will do this in meetings, I've got a habit of someone will explain an issue or a concern about, a problem in the kitchen or gas or all those, and I'll say, show me. Let's go for a walk. Show me. Because
Yeah.
if I can actually understand it and I've walked through there, it makes it much easier for me to understand and explain that again to those decision makers.
I like that. Yes. Simon McGrath, who used to obviously be the CEO of Core for many years, I asked him what was one of his strengths, and he said it was his ability to ask questions. He said, if I can ask enough questions and I can understand a situation, then I'm sure we can find a solution. And as you said, I think it's important that we do understand what is going on and have you as a conduit to support our industry, as you said, with the government.
An exciting year, and we're probably, we'll be in an election campaign in no time. So
Yeah.
we've got our top priorities. So tourism demand, training and skills, migration, rental, and those operating costs and things like those energy bills. There's our election
Top five.
manifesto.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. All quite important issues. James, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Brendon, and thanks for everyone for listening and watching.